Welcome to Shadowed Story. Hit the subscribe button and join the Shadowed Story family. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. The Last Hiker. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon as we gathered at the base of the mountain. Our backpacks loaded with supplies for what was supposed to be a challenging yet rewarding adventure. The morning air was crisp, biting at our skin, and the distant call of a bird echoed in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. We had been planning this hike for months, excited to escape the mundane pressures of city life and tackle one of the toughest trails in the region. The mountain loomed before us, its jagged silhouette cutting against the early light, an ominous but thrilling presence. There were 5 of us: me, Mike, Claire, Tim, and Sophia. We had all been friends since high school, and when the idea of hiking this trail first came up, we jumped at the chance. Sure, the locals warned us about the trail's reputation, whispers of hikers who had gone missing over the years, the strange carvings that appeared on the trees, the way the mountain seemed to consume those who ventured too far. But those were just stories, right? We were experienced hikers. We had trained for months. There was no way something like that would happen to us. At least, that's what I told myself as I adjusted the straps on my backpack and looked up at Sophia, who was standing a few feet away, scanning the landscape with an intense focus. Sophia had always been the one who pushed the group toward adventure, the one with a bold spirit that seemed to believe in the impossible. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. None of us did, really. The excitement of the challenge overshadowed any fleeting doubts. "All right," Mike said, grinning as he tightened the last strap on his pack. "Let's get this show on the road. We've got a mountain to conquer." Claire laughed, and Tim, usually the more reserved one, gave a small, approving nod. I just smiled and adjusted my gear, trying to keep my nerves in check. We began our ascent, the trail winding through dense forests of pine and fir trees. The ground beneath us was rocky and uneven, but nothing too difficult to manage. We chatted easily at first, sharing stories from our recent lives, recalling inside jokes, and laughing about the small inconveniences of life. The day passed by like this, relatively carefree and lighthearted. As we made our way up the mountain, I couldn't help but admire the serenity around us. The forest was untouched, the air fresh, and the only sounds were the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves beneath our boots. Sophia, however, seemed different. She had always been the most energetic of us, the one who kept everyone moving, pushing us to go further, to explore more. But today, she had been unusually quiet. Every now and then, I'd catch her staring off into the distance, her gaze fixed on something in the trees. Her face, which usually radiated enthusiasm, was unreadable, her lips pressed together in a way that made her look as though she were deep in thought, or perhaps deep in something else. At lunch, we took a break by a clear stream, its water flowing gently over smooth rocks. I sat down on a large stone, unpacking my food, while the others gathered around. Mike was cracking jokes, as usual, and Claire was laughing along with him. Tim, ever the serious one, sat a little apart, taking a few moments to check the map and adjust his gear. But Sophia stayed standing, her eyes tracing the line of trees ahead of us. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as though she was resisting some urge to act on whatever had her attention. "Sophia?" I called out, and she snapped out of her trance, blinking rapidly as though waking from a dream. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, sorry. Just thinking about the trail ahead," she said, though her voice sounded distant. "I'll be fine." I exchanged a glance with Tim, but neither of us said anything. Maybe she was just tired. We all were. We finished our break, packed up, and continued the hike. The trail was starting to steepen, the path narrower and more rugged as we climbed higher. The forest around us seemed to grow darker, the trees closer together, their branches thick and tangled. I noticed the silence creeping in. The birds had stopped calling, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots against the dirt and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. As we trudged onward, I saw Sophia lagging behind, her pace slower than usual. She was no longer talking or cracking jokes. Her eyes were locked on the trees, scanning the bark with an intensity that made me uneasy. "Hey, Sophia," I called, trying to catch her attention. "You doing okay?" She looked up at me, but her gaze was unsettling. It wasn't the usual warm, confident look she gave when someone called her name. Instead, her eyes were wide, unfocused, almost vacant. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quiet, but there was a strange tone to it, almost like she was speaking to someone else, not to me. We kept going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I glanced back at Sophia, noticing how she seemed to drift further away from the group. Her movements were jerky, as if she was fighting against some invisible force. Tim, walking next to me, leaned in. "Something's wrong with her," he muttered under his breath. "I know," I replied, keeping my voice low. "But what can we do? We don't know what's going on." We pressed on, but it wasn't long before the tension in the air grew thicker. We had entered a part of the forest where the trees were more twisted and gnarled, their trunks dark and weathered. The ground was uneven, and the path had begun to disappear into a tangle of roots and loose rocks. The wind had picked up, and it seemed to howl through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sense of unease. And then, we saw it. At first, it was just a faint mark on the trunk of a tree, a simple slash. But as we continued, the markings became more frequent, and they grew more intricate. Strange symbols were carved into the bark, spirals, circles, and lines that seemed to shift and move as we looked at them. They were not random. They were deliberate, purposeful. "What the hell is this?" Mike asked, his voice tense as he stopped to inspect one of the markings. His face twisted in confusion and discomfort. "I don't know," Claire said, her voice trembling, "but I don't like it." We stopped walking, and I took a step closer to the symbols. Some of them looked like eyes, deep, hollow eyes, carved into the bark with a jagged hand. Others were spiral patterns, twisting in on themselves in a way that made my head spin. I couldn't help but feel like the trees were watching us, like they were alive, waiting. "Sophia," I called, but she didn't respond. When I looked back, I saw her standing at the edge of the group, her back turned to us. Her hands were shaking, and her head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening for something. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and I could see her breath in the air despite the warmth of the day. "Sophia," Claire called out sharply, but Sophia didn't turn. She was staring at the markings, her lips moving, whispering something under her breath. "This isn't right," Tim said, his voice low. "We need to go back." But before we could make a decision, Sophia's head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto mine. They weren't the same eyes I knew. They were cold, vacant, distant. "I've found them," she said, her voice distorted, as if it were someone else speaking through her. "They've been waiting." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Found who?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. Sophia's lips curved into an unsettling smile, but there was no joy in it, just something empty. She slowly began to turn away from us, as though drawn to something deeper in the forest. "We shouldn't be here," I whispered, but Sophia was already walking away, moving toward the shadows of the trees, her steps slow, deliberate. "Wait, Sophia," I called, but she didn't respond. She was already lost to the forest. And then, everything went silent. The silence that followed Sophia's departure was deafening, an almost tangible weight pressing down on the four of us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air thick and suffocating. For a moment, none of us moved, unsure of what to do. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. "We can't just let her go." Claire's voice broke the quiet, trembling with fear and desperation. She turned to us, her eyes wide. "We have to bring her back." Tim looked down the path where Sophia had disappeared, his jaw tight. "Something's wrong with her," he muttered. "This place," he gestured to the forest around us, the gnarled trees, the eerie carvings. "It's doing something to her. We have to find her," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We can't leave her out there alone." Mike hesitated, his usual bravado gone. What if she doesn't want to come back? You saw her eyes. That wasn't Sophia anymore." The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed it away. "She's our friend," I said. "We don't leave her behind." Tim sighed, pulling the map from his pack, though I could tell he didn't believe it would help. The forest was dense, the trail barely visible, and Sophia had wandered off into a direction that wasn't marked. It was as though she was following something only she could see. With no other choice, we started after her. The path was treacherous, the uneven ground making every step a challenge. The strange carvings grew more frequent, their shapes twisting into more elaborate, almost menacing designs. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The air was cold now, unnaturally so, and a faint mist began to creep along the forest floor, curling around our ankles like ghostly tendrils. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense that barely any light filtered through. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. We stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was only the sound of the wind, whistling through the trees. But then, faintly, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, followed by a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. It was distant, but it was there. "What is that?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Tim said, his grip tightening on the walking stick he carried. "But we need to keep moving." We pressed on, the sound growing louder with each step. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the forest in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I tried to focus on Sophia, on finding her and getting out of this nightmare. Finally, we saw her. She was standing in a small clearing, her back to us, her head tilted upward as though staring at something in the trees. The mist was thicker here, swirling around her like a living thing. The carvings on the surrounding trees were larger, more intricate, their shapes almost seeming to pulse and shift when I looked at them. "Sophia," I called out, but she didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "Sophia, please," Claire said, stepping forward. "Come back with us." As Claire moved closer, Sophia slowly turned to face us. Her expression was blank, her eyes empty. But what was most disturbing was her smile, a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across her face. "They're coming," she said, her voice a low whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Who's coming?" Tim demanded, his voice sharp. Sophia tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "The ones who watch, the ones who take." Suddenly, the growling noise returned, louder now, closer. It reverberated through the clearing, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The mist thickened, and shadows began to emerge from the trees. Tall, elongated shapes that didn't move like anything human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were getting closer. "We need to leave. Now," Tim said, his voice urgent. But Sophia didn't move. She stepped toward the shadows, her arms outstretched as though welcoming them. "This is where I belong," she said, her voice calm, almost serene. "No," I shouted, rushing toward her. But before I could reach her, one of the shadowy figures stepped into the clearing. It was tall, its form twisted and unnatural, its limbs too long and thin. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, a smooth expanse of darkness that seemed to absorb the light. It moved with an unnatural grace, each step silent despite its size. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. The creature didn't look at me. It looked at Sophia. She turned to face it, her expression one of reverence, as though she were seeing something beautiful. "They've chosen me," she whispered. "Sophia, don't." I shouted, but she ignored me. She reached out toward the creature, her hand trembling. As her fingers touched its shadowy form, the creature let out a deafening screech, a sound that pierced through me and made my ears ring. The mist exploded outward, enveloping the clearing in a blinding white haze. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except that horrible sound. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. When the mist cleared, Sophia was gone. The clearing was empty. The shadowy figures vanished. The only evidence that they had been there at all was the strange symbols carved into the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, none of us spoke. We were too stunned, too horrified. Claire was crying, her hands pressed to her mouth. Mike looked like he was in shock, his face pale and his eyes wide. Tim clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he stared at the spot where Sophia had disappeared. What the hell just happened? Mike finally whispered. The mountain took her, Tim said, his voice low, just like it's taken others before. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. No, we have to find her. She can't be gone. She's gone, Tim said firmly. And if we don't leave now, we'll be next. Reluctantly, we turned and began the long, harrowing journey back down the mountain. The forest seemed darker now, more oppressive, as though it were angry that we had escaped. The carvings on the trees seemed to watch us, their shapes twisting and changing as we passed. The growling sound returned, faint but constant, a reminder that we were not alone. When we finally emerged from the forest, the sun was setting, casting the mountain in a blood-red light. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the trailhead, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Sophia was gone, claimed by the mountain, and though we had escaped, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left. The forest had marked us, just as it had marked her. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear the growling in the back of my mind, still see the symbols carved into the trees when I close my eyes. I don't know what the mountain is, or why it takes people, but I do know one thing. It doesn't let go, and I'm terrified that someday it will come for me.